only the courage of someone who had been silenced for far too long. What she said that night stopped the ballroom. But what she did afterward, no one would ever forget. If this story touches you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Your support is what keeps this channel alive. The Whitmore estate stood on the cliffs of Monterey, a forgotten palace hidden beneath layers of fog and secrets. From a distance, it looked like a castle from a dream, or perhaps a memory too proud to fade. The heavy, ornate iron gates groaned open only for a select few, and ivy climbed the stone columns. Silence reigned over the winding paths, broken only by the wind carrying the scent of the ocean through the marble corridors. Inside, time seemed to stand still. Every hallway, every antique clock, and every oil painting on the walls seemed to whisper of grandeur long past. In the heart of this vast mansion lived Richard Whitmore, a man as elusive as the fog surrounding his home. Billionaire, mogul, enigma. He had built hotel empires that spanned continents, amassed rare masterpieces kept under lock and key, and could move financial markets with a single call. Yet, he dined alone, slept alone, and rarely smiled unless it was for the press. His staff had learned to move like shadows, efficient, invisible, and silent. That's how Richard preferred it. A man of habits, cold, precise, and unwavering. His mornings started at 6 with freshly brewed Colombian coffee, and his schedule was organized to the second. Emotions, he believed, were distractions, and distractions were dangerous. But in a house designed to silence all emotion, there was one presence that subtly disrupted his order. Emily Thompson, just a maid, or so it seemed. She arrived early every day, wearing the same worn-out sneakers and tying her hair into a loose knot that always came undone by noon. She carried her cleaning supplies like a soldier carried armor, quietly, dutifully. Her uniform was always spotless, even when the world around her wasn't. She didn't speak unless asked, didn't pause unless instructed, and never complained, even when her hands turned red from scrubbing brass fixtures in winter. Yet there was something else about her, something that couldn't be defined by her job or her silence. It was in the way her fingers lingered just a heartbeat longer on the edges of things, the way she adjusted a crooked painting, not because it was required, but because it bothered her, the way she paused in front of the grand piano in the drawing room, her eyes softening, as if she could hear music no one else remembered. Richard noticed. He would never admit it, not even to himself, but he noticed the light in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. He noticed how she moved, not like a servant, but like someone raised in the shadows who had learned to carry dignity without permission. One evening, after a dinner that he barely tasted, Richard wandered into the dimly lit library. The fire was dying, and the scent of old books filled the air. There she was, on her knees scrubbing the marble fireplace, her sleeves rolled up, strands of hair clinging to her cheeks. She hummed something faint and melodic, a lullaby maybe, or a song from a time before the silence. He didn't announce himself. He simply watched, hidden behind the bookshelves. And in that moment, something shifted, not in her, but in him. For the first time in years, Richard Whitmore saw someone not trying to impress him, manipulate him, or take something from him. She was just there, present, real, and unafraid of being unseen. The next morning, Richard asked his butler over breakfast, "What's the name of the girl who cleans the East Wing?" The question, though simple, left the butler blinking. "Emily Thompson, sir." He nodded once. A name. It lingered on his lips longer than it should have. Emily. Days passed, then weeks, and he began to notice more. The scent of lemon polish after she cleaned, the faint hum she left behind, like a trace of her soul, the way she handled the old chandelier crystals as if each one were sacred. Her silence wasn't emptiness, it was resilience. Her presence wasn't invisibility, it was grace restrained. And suddenly, Richard couldn't ignore what had once been background noise. He found himself listening for the sound of her footsteps, noticing the absence of her presence when she was off duty, wondering if she ever looked out from the high windows and dreamed beyond those walls. He told himself it was curiosity. But when the Golden Phoenix charity ball approached, a night of glittering gowns, political handshakes, and media lenses. He found himself uninterested in every socialite, heiress, and model whose names filled the guest list. The thought crept in like a whisper. What if it was reckless, unorthodox, unacceptable by every elite standard? But Richard Whitmore had never been a man to follow rules he didn't believe in. That afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the stained glass windows, he stood in his study, watching the east hallway through a heavy velvet curtain. Emily had just finished setting fresh flowers in the foyer. Her fingers brushed a single petal that had fallen. She didn't know he was watching, but for the first time he didn't look away. And then, calm, cold, certain, he called for his personal tailor. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the Whitmore estate, casting soft rainbows across the marble floors. Emily stood at the base of the grand staircase, wringing out a mop, the scent of lavender cleaner rising into the still air. Her hands moved automatically, following the same rhythm, the same steps, day after day. She liked the silence. It was safer than words. Words brought attention, and attention was dangerous. She had learned long ago that invisibility was a kind of shield. In the orphanage on Fifth Avenue, the loudest girls got into trouble. The quiet ones survived. Emily had mastered the art of shrinking herself until she became part of the furniture, useful, silent, forgotten. But that morning something felt different. The butler, always composed, always unreadable, approached her just as she was folding the cleaning cloth into the linen cart. He cleared his throat. "Miss Thompson," he said stiffly, "Mr. Whitmore wishes to see you in the drawing room immediately." Emily blinked. She must have misheard. The drawing room? Her? She hesitated, glancing down at her uniform, plain, functional, with a faint bleach mark on the hem. Her palms were still damp. She smelled like lemon wax and floor soap. "Now?" she asked, her voice small. "Now?" the butler repeated, his look leaving no room for questions. Her heart thudded unevenly as she walked through the corridor. Each step echoed louder than it should have. She passed portraits of Whitmores long gone, stern faces staring down at her as if she didn't belong. When she reached the drawing room, the door was already open. Richard Whitmore stood by the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a crystal glass of water. He didn't look up at first. The fire cast a golden hue across his sharp, unreadable profile. She stopped just inside the doorway. "Sir?" He turned slowly, his gaze settling on her like a weight. There was a pause, an awkward silence thick with something she couldn't name. Then he spoke. "I need you to come with me tomorrow night." Emily blinked. "Come with you, sir." "To the Golden Phoenix charity ball." The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. She almost laughed, thinking it was a mistake, a test. But Richard's expression remained calm, not amused, not cruel, just absolute. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You don't have to, just be ready by 7. She opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out. What could she say? That she had nothing to wear? That she didn't belong in a ballroom? That people like her weren't meant to be seen, only used? Instead, she nodded faintly. "Yes, sir," and turned to leave. Her legs trembled as she walked back through the corridor, down the stairs, into the service wing. Only when the heavy kitchen door swung closed behind her did she drop the mop handle and press both palms against the cold metal. He couldn't be serious. But when she returned to her quarters that evening, a long box lay on her bed. Inside was a gown, the color of midnight, shimmering with tiny crystal beads like stars across an infinite sky. Next to it was a handwritten note in neat cursive. "Wear this. No one can look away from what dares to be seen." R.W. Emily stared at it for a long time. She had never worn anything like it. She had never owned anything like it. The fabric was impossibly soft, the cut precise. It didn't feel like a dress. It felt like a declaration, a rebellion against every voice that had told her she wasn't enough. Still, fear gripped her. What if it was a trick? What if he just wanted to humiliate her? What if the moment she stepped into that ballroom, everyone would see what she really was, a maid in borrowed beauty? She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands curled in her lap, eyes unfocused. Her mind raced. She remembered the orphanage's cold showers, the way she used to clutch her book, The Little Prince, like a lifeline. The nights she lay awake, whispering to herself that one day someone would see her. Was this that day, or just another illusion? Late that night, unable to sleep, she stood barefoot in front of the mirror. The dress shimmered in the moonlight. She hadn't put it on yet. She just stared at it, as if afraid it might vanish if she blinked. She didn't recognize the girl reflected in the glass. Not quite, but she didn't turn away. Meanwhile, in another wing of the house, Richard sat in his study, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He hadn't told anyone why he'd invited her. Not his assistant, not his advisors. They would have tried to talk him out of it. They would have reminded him of appearances, of scandal, of image. But Richard didn't care about appearances anymore. He had watched enough masks to know that those who wore the finest were often the ones with the darkest secrets. Emily had no mask, and that made her dangerous to a world built on illusion. As the fire crackled beside him, Richard allowed himself a small, rare smile. He had no idea what the night would bring, but something inside him whispered. It wouldn't be ordinary. And far away, Emily finally slipped the dress over her frame, the fabric cool against her skin. She stood straighter, took one quiet breath, and everything in her life began to shift. The night of the Golden Phoenix Ball arrived, like the unfolding of a prophecy no one had seen coming. The estate was unusually quiet, the staff instructed to remain discreet. Outside, black cars glided up and down the long stone driveway, headlights slicing through the mist like searchlights. The world beyond the gate belonged to the rich, the powerful, the untouchable. And for the first time, Emily Thompson was being pulled into it, not as a servant but as something entirely different. She stood in her room staring at her reflection. The dress fit perfectly. Midnight blue, sleeveless, with a delicate plunge that revealed just enough without compromising her dignity. Tiny crystals were stitched along the fabric, like stars scattered across a private sky. Her hair had been styled softly, loose waves tucked behind one ear, exposing the line of her neck. She wore no jewelry except for a single silver bracelet, one she had found in a forgotten drawer in the laundry wing years ago. She didn't know who it belonged to, but tonight it belonged to her. For a long moment she didn't move. The girl in the mirror was both familiar and foreign. Her eyes were the same, sharp, careful, deeply guarded, but everything else felt reborn. She no longer looked like someone trying to be invisible. She looked like someone the world could not afford to ignore. A knock. The butler appeared, his eyes lowered. "Mr. Whitmore is waiting." Emily's heart drummed as she followed him through the long corridor. Every step on the marble floor felt amplified, every breath too shallow. When they reached the foyer, she saw him, Richard Whitmore, standing by the staircase in a tailored black tuxedo, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He turned. For a fleeting second, he didn't speak. He simply stared. The same man who negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking was now struggling to find words. His eyes moved over her, not hungrily, not possessively, but with something far more dangerous. Recognition. "You look," he began, but stopped. She tilted her head slightly. "Like someone else?" He shook his head. "No, like yourself." Finally. And then, offering his arm, he said softly, "Shall we?" They stepped into the black car waiting outside, windows tinted to block out the stares of the world. The ride to the Golden Phoenix Hotel was silent, yet pulsing with energy. Neither spoke much, but there was an awareness between them, a current of something unspoken, tugging, forming, daring to exist. The hotel shimmered like a palace. Golden chandeliers spilled light across the grand staircase, and violins played from a live quartet near the ballroom entrance. High society moved through the halls with effortless grace, their conversations stitched with names, deals, and gossip. And then she stepped out of the car. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A girl no one recognized, wearing a dress more exquisite than most of the heiresses in attendance. Her hand tucked gently into Richard Whitmore's arm, her chin held high, not with arrogance, but with quiet strength. Photographers snapped. Glances were exchanged. The whispering began. Who was she? Where did she come from? What was her story? But Emily didn't flinch. She walked with him into the ballroom, past rows of people whose names were printed on magazines and embroidered on handbags. She didn't smile. She didn't shrink. She simply existed, fully, vulnerably, beautifully, and that alone made her unstoppable. At the top of the staircase leading into the grand ballroom, the announcer cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Richard Whitmore and his guest, Miss Emily Thompson." It was the first time her name had ever echoed off marble walls and chandeliers. 1,000 eyes turned. Richard leaned closer. "Ready?" Her throat tightened. "No." He smiled. "Good." Then they descended. The ballroom quieted. Even the music faded into the background. Every step down that staircase felt like a choice, a rebellion, a declaration that she would no longer hide. And as they reached the last step, Richard gently placed his hand on her back, guiding her toward the center of the room. The violins resumed, playing a slow waltz. Without asking, he extended his hand. Emily hesitated, then placed her hand in his. They danced. Her steps were cautious at first, but his movements were steady, confident, reassuring. Around them the elite watched, their champagne untouched, their conversations forgotten. It was like watching a story unfold that none of them had been invited to write. And still she danced. She wasn't perfect. Her rhythm faltered once. Her heel caught the hem of her dress. But she didn't run, didn't apologize. And Richard, he didn't laugh. He didn't correct her. He simply looked at her like the world had finally shown him something new. When the music ended, there was no applause, just stunned silence. And then, "Who is she?" someone whispered. "She must be European," said another. "No American girl walks like that unless she's royalty." "No," came a third voice, colder, sharper. "She's an actress. Or worse, his newest amusement." Emily heard it all, but she didn't react. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't surviving. She was becoming. But not everyone in that ballroom would celebrate her transformation. In the far corner of the room, beneath a golden chandelier, stood a woman in a crimson gown, holding a champagne flute with nails painted like blood. Madison Holloway, heir to Holloway Pharmaceuticals, Richard's former flame, and she was already walking toward them. It didn't take long. As soon as Emily and Richard stepped away from the dance floor, the whispers ignited like wildfire across the ballroom, soft enough to be discreet, sharp enough to draw blood. She didn't belong. That much everyone agreed on. But who was she? A rising heiress from the south of France? An actress hired for flair? A scandal wrapped in satin? By the time Emily reached the refreshment table, a dozen narratives had already been invented for her, and each one more scandalous than the last. "She must be a countess," someone said near the bar, sipping gin with a hint of venom. "Only foreign nobility walks with that kind of poise." "No, she's a political pawn," whispered a woman in a silver gown. "Richard's playing a long game. This is about the Monroe deal. I heard she saved his life once, maybe in a car accident or a hospital. Something dramatic. You know Richard, he's always been a sucker for guilt. She's not just a date. He's going to marry her. Please. That girl's a phase. You can smell the novelty." Every woman in the room suddenly felt off balance, as if Emily had broken some unspoken law, and every man, especially the married ones, watched her too long, too openly. But while the elite speculated, Emily walked through the ballroom as if none of it touched her. Not because she didn't hear, it was impossible not to, but because she had trained her entire life to survive being underestimated. The cruelty of polite society was no match for the silent humiliations she had endured in silence, as a girl scrubbing kitchen tiles on her knees. Still, there was a weight to it, 1,000 eyes pressing into her skin like pins. Every step in her heels felt heavier now, every smile harder to hold. She reached for a glass of sparkling water and barely sipped it, afraid her hand might shake. Across the room, she saw Richard speaking to a group of diplomats, calm, poised, powerful, as if the woman he had brought tonight wasn't causing a social earthquake under their feet. And then someone stepped into her path. A man, mid-40s, dark suit, perfect smile with no warmth behind it. "Miss Thompson, is it?" She stiffened. "Yes, I'm Gregory Haynes," I manage PR for one of the Whitmore subsidiaries. We haven't met." "Pleasure," she said, extending a hand. He didn't take it. Instead, he tilted his head. "May I ask what exactly you do?" She hesitated. "I work at the Whitmore estate. As staff?" There it was. She held his gaze. "Yes." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, then amusement, then something nastier. "Well," he said smoothly, "I suppose we all start somewhere." Before she could answer, he was gone, already turning to charm someone else. Emily exhaled slowly, then turned away from the crowd, heading for the far balcony. She needed air, silence, distance. Outside, the night was cooler. The city lights glittered beneath the horizon like spilled gold. She gripped the railing, letting the cool metal ground her. She had known it would be hard, but she hadn't expected the room to feel like a courtroom. From inside, muted through the glass, she heard laughter that wasn't laughter. Champagne glasses clinking like weapons, and a woman's voice rising a little louder than it should have. "Oh, come on. Richard Whitmore doesn't fall in love. He invests." Emily flinched. "Then, I heard she used to be a street girl. He probably picked her up on the way here." The words didn't crush her, but they cracked something. She looked down at her hands, resting gently on the edge of the balcony. They were shaking now. Behind her, a voice spoke gently. She shouldn't have said that. Emily turned. It was Elizabeth Monroe, a tall, striking woman in her early 50s, with a navy gown and steel in her posture. She was one of the few people Emily had actually recognized from the media. Philanthropist, investor, founder of one of the most powerful educational foundations in the country. "I'm sorry," Emily said automatically. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "For what? Existing?" Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. "You walked into a room that's terrified of you," Elizabeth continued, "because you didn't come through the front door like they did. And you're still outshining them." Emily blinked. "I'm not trying to—" "I know, that's why it's working." For a moment they stood in silence. Then Elizabeth added quietly, "You don't know this yet, but tonight, you've already made history." Before Emily could respond, the door to the balcony opened again, and the temperature in the air changed. Madison Holloway stepped into the light. Her crimson dress clung like fire. Her smile was subtle and sharpened like a dagger. "Elizabeth," she said sweetly, always the mentor. Elizabeth didn't flinch. "Madison." Then Madison turned her attention to Emily. "So," she said softly, "you're the new myth." Emily didn't answer. Madison stepped closer, heels clicking. "I've known Richard for a long time," she said, swirling her champagne. "You're not his type." "And yet," Elizabeth cut in calmly, "she's the only one he brought tonight." The silence that followed was thick as velvet. Madison's jaw twitched, but she smiled again. "Well then," she said, raising her glass, "let's see how long the fantasy lasts." She turned and walked away, leaving the scent of roses and venom in the air. Elizabeth leaned close and whispered, "Careful with that one. She doesn't like to lose." But Emily's eyes were no longer on Madison. They were on Richard. He was watching her through the glass, expression unreadable. But his eyes, they weren't cold. They were proud. And yet, there was something else. Something she couldn't name yet. Something that was about to shift everything. The ballroom glowed with golden light, but Emily's skin felt cold. After the encounter on the balcony, her pulse hadn't settled. Madison Holloway's words clung to her like smoke, sweetly poisonous, designed not to wound directly, but to unravel her from within. And yet, something inside her hadn't crumbled. Not this time. She had always survived by retreating into silence. It was her armor, her invisibility cloak. But tonight, silence felt different. It wasn't a retreat. It was a choice. She re-entered the ballroom with her chin lifted, not in defiance but in quiet command. Eyes turned again. Her presence was no longer an anomaly. It was a disruption, a challenge, the kind that made socialites shift in their heels and whisper behind crystal flutes. She didn't smile, didn't try to soften her edges. She walked with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had nothing to prove. but everything to say. And it was in that exact moment that Madison moved to intercept her again, like a shark circling open water. "Emily," she purred, holding 2 glasses of champagne as if offering peace. "I never had the chance to welcome you properly. That dress, it's daring, almost bold." Emily stopped. Madison's eyes sparkled with false sweetness. "Richard has such a soft spot for lost causes, doesn't he? I suppose it makes him feel like a savior." Emily didn't take the bait, but she did take the glass. "Thank you," she said evenly. "I've heard a lot about you." "Oh, I'm sure," Madison replied, stepping closer. "It must be overwhelming, suddenly surrounded by people who've had everything handed to them. Education, legacy, money, heritage." The word dripped like honey over a blade. Emily's eyes didn't flinch. "Overwhelming?" she said, voice low and calm. "Maybe, but not unfamiliar. I've seen people like you before." Madison tilted her head. "Have you?" "Yes, at the orphanage. We used to get donors who visited once a year. They brought smiles, photo ops, and promises they never remembered. We used to count how fast they forgot our names." A flicker crossed Madison's face, then vanished beneath a polished grin. "I see," she said softly. "So, this is revenge?" Emily leaned in slightly. "No, this is presence." The words landed like thunder in velvet. Elizabeth Monroe, standing nearby, let the corners of her mouth rise, just barely. But Madison didn't back down. "You're not staying," she said coldly. "This is a moment, not a place." Emily took a slow sip of champagne, eyes never leaving hers. "Maybe, but this moment is mine, and you'll remember it." The silence between them stretched taut. Then, as if nothing had happened, Emily turned and walked away. No flinching, no second-guessing. Just her back to the woman who once believed she could crush her. And suddenly, the ballroom didn't feel like enemy territory anymore. It felt like a stage. Behind her, murmurs shifted. Some in awe, others in discomfort. And somewhere in the far-right corner, a well-known journalist scribbled in a notebook. Emily found her way to a quieter corner near the gallery of paintings. Her fingers lightly traced the frame of an impressionist piece, an ocean scene, stormy and wild. "Beautiful," said a voice beside her. It was Richard. He stood close but didn't touch her. His presence, steady and warm, was enough. "You handled her," he said, voice low. "She's not the first wolf I've seen in silk." He smiled, genuinely this time. "I knew you had fire in you." Emily looked up at him. "Then why bring me here? Why do this to me?" Richard's gaze softened. "Because I needed the room to see what I already knew. That power doesn't come from legacy. It comes from survival, from self-respect, from being exactly who you are, even when the world tries to shame you for it." Emily searched his face, looking for mockery, for calculation. There was none, only something steady, proud, almost protective. "Are you using me?" she asked quietly. "No," he said, "but I may be learning from you." She didn't respond right away. The idea unsettled her, that someone like him, with his tailored life and sculpted power, could see her as more than a spectacle, more than a gamble, more than a maid. She turned back to the painting. "I'm not a story, Richard." "I know," he said, "but they'll write one about you anyway." At that, she laughed softly, just once, then exhaled. "Let them," she whispered. They stood there in silence, but beneath the stillness something new had formed between them. Not just attraction, not just intrigue, recognition. And yet, across the room, not everyone celebrated Emily's moment of strength. In a corner where candlelight flickered low, a man in a press badge spoke quietly into a phone. "Yes. Her name's Emily Thompson. I have confirmation from a source. Former orphan. Currently on Whitmore's staff. No public background. No known education." He paused, then smirked. "Exactly, it's the perfect scandal. And I have the photo." He hung up. And just like that, the clock began ticking. The world was about to come knocking. The ballroom noise swelled behind her like distant waves, a current of laughter, crystal clinks and synthetic charm. But Emily had drifted to the quieter parts of the hotel now, ornate hallways where chandeliers whispered instead of roared, and the paintings on the walls seemed to watch without judgment. She needed space. The confrontation with Madison had left a tremor beneath her ribs, not from fear but from something deeper, old echoes of worthlessness trying to crawl back in through the cracks. But she had held her ground. And for the first time in her life, she had not just survived a confrontation, she had won it. Still, the silence helped her breathe again. She passed a velvet rope that separated the ballroom from a private lounge, a quieter chamber for the donors and dignitaries who wanted to talk business instead of dance. A few suited men and women lingered near the entrance, sipping aged whiskey, voices low and serious. And then she saw him. An older man with a silver mustache and a limp, dressed in a server's uniform. He moved slowly, carefully balancing a tray of empty glasses. His posture was tired but precise, like someone who had served his entire life without asking for anything in return. At first, Emily didn't recognize him, but something about the way he tilted his head, the kindness in his tired eyes, tugged at her like a memory not quite recovered, and then he turned fully toward her. The glass on his tray trembled. "Emily," he said softly, almost afraid to believe it. Her heart skipped. She blinked, unsure. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" His eyes filled. He stepped forward, carefully setting the tray down on a nearby table. "It's me," he said. "Mr. Langley, from the Fifth Avenue orphanage." And just like that, the years collapsed. She saw it all at once. The hallway with peeling paint, the cot by the radiator, the book with the fox on the cover, his hands steadying hers as she cried silently after another girl tore her only dress. "Mr. Langley," she breathed. He smiled. "You used to read The Little Prince under the stairs. You told me the stars felt closer when it rained." Her throat tightened. "I haven't thought about that in years." "I never forgot you," he said. "You were always different. Quieter." Watching the world with questions in your eyes, Emily stepped closer. "I thought you left." "I was let go," he said with a sad shrug. "Funding cuts. They brought in younger staff. Said I was too slow, but I knew you'd make it out one day. I just never imagined like this." She laughed softly, then wiped her eyes before the tears could ruin her makeup. "This wasn't planned," she whispered. He nodded, glancing around the opulence. "It rarely is." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Mr. Langley reached into his pocket and pulled out something worn. Edges frayed, cover creased. It was The Little Prince. Her breath caught. "You kept it. I found it in the donation bin after you left," he said gently. "I thought you'd want it back someday." Emily took the book with trembling fingers. Her name was still scribbled inside the front cover in clumsy, childish handwriting. Her voice broke. "I used to pretend I was the fox, the one waiting to be tamed. And now?" She looked up, eyes glistening. "Now I think I was the rose." He smiled, proud and quiet. And for a moment, all the noise, all the rumors, all the glitter of the ballroom faded. All that remained was the memory of a little girl who had once been invisible to the world, and the man who had seen her even then. "I'm glad you found your way," he said. Emily clutched the book to her chest. "I'm still finding it." From the corner of the hallway, a flash sparked. Click. A camera. Emily turned, startled. A photographer quickly lowered his lens and vanished into the shadows before she could see who it was. Her heart began to race again. Mr. Langley noticed. "Are you all right?" "I don't know," she whispered. "Someone's watching." He gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "Let them. You've already survived worse." She nodded, exhaling slowly. But the warmth of the moment had changed. Something had shifted. As she returned toward the ballroom, clutching the book, her steps were slower. The memory had grounded her, but the intrusion had reminded her that even vulnerability could be weaponized in a world hungry for scandal. Still, she didn't hide the book. She held it in plain view. And when Richard saw her return with eyes slightly red, shoulders squared, and that tattered book in hand, he didn't question her. He only stepped aside to let her walk past him into the room. Like someone who knew, whatever had just happened, had made her stronger. The ballroom had returned to its rhythm, but something had shifted. The murmurs about Emily were still there, some laced with envy, others curiosity. But now they carried less certainty. She had not only stayed, she had walked, confronted, spoken, and returned. She had survived their gaze. Emily stood quietly near a table of roses, tracing the edge of a crystal vase with her fingertip. The book was still in her hands. She hadn't let go since Mr. Langley placed it there. Something about its worn weight reminded her she was real, no matter what they said. But it was what happened next that neither she nor anyone else could have predicted. A cluster of photographers and reporters had been let in. They were supposed to stay near the lobby, capturing polite moments. A senator clinking glasses, a model laughing at a CEO's joke, the usual dance of status. But now they hovered just beyond the main chandelier, waiting as if something significant was about to happen. And then the murmuring stopped, because Richard Whitmore had walked up to the platform. There was no announcement, no music change, just him, straight-backed, expression calm, presence undeniable. His tuxedo was sharp, but not ostentatious. He carried no speech, no paper, only his voice. He glanced once toward Emily across the room, and then he spoke. "Many of you have asked me tonight," he began, "who she is." The room froze. "She," he continued, his eyes still on Emily, "is someone this world was not ready to see, so it trained her to disappear, to work in silence, to serve without being acknowledged." Emily felt every word land like thunder wrapped in velvet. "But here's the truth," Richard said, voice steady. "She is not a mystery. She is not a rumor. She is not an accessory to anyone's narrative. She is someone who every single day chose dignity when the world offered invisibility." Gasps rippled through the room. "She didn't ask to be here tonight. I asked her, not as a display, not as a statement, but because I wanted the world to meet someone I admire." He paused, let the weight of silence fall again. "For years," he said, "we've mistaken wealth for wisdom, legacy for value, applause for worth. But tonight, I'd like to offer a different kind of recognition." And then, he stepped down from the platform, walked slowly, deliberately across the marble floor, past senators and CEOs, past old money and new influence, until he stood in front of Emily. The room held its breath. And then, he reached out, not for her waist, not for her hand, but for her book. He lifted the little prince into the light. "This," he said, turning slightly to address the room, "is not just a book. It's a symbol of a girl who read by kitchen light, who scrubbed floors by day and dreamed quietly by night, who survived being forgotten, and who now stands here, not because of me, but in spite of everything before me." He turned to her fully. "Thank you," he said, "for allowing me to witness you." Emily didn't know whether to cry or speak, so she simply nodded. But the silence that followed was no longer awkward. It was reverent. And then, one clap, then another. Then an eruption of applause that rolled through the ballroom like thunder, finally breaking through rain-heavy skies. Not everyone clapped, but enough did. Women in gowns lowered their eyes, humbled. Men in suits leaned forward, curious. And a girl from the catering staff, no older than Emily had been when she entered the estate, stood frozen near the back, tears quietly streaking her cheek. Because in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. If she could be seen, maybe I could too. When the applause settled, Richard handed the book back to Emily. No grand gesture, no embrace, just a look. One that said, "You've changed the temperature of this room, and you don't even know it yet." As the music returned and people began to move again, the ripple continued. Reporters took new notes. Some guests looked at her differently now, not with disdain, but with hesitation, as if questioning the walls they had always accepted. And then a voice behind her said gently, "Miss Thompson?" Emily turned. A journalist, microphone in hand, eyes searching. "Forgive me for interrupting, but I have to ask." Richard stepped back, giving her space. "Was tonight about love? Or a message?" Emily's heartbeat slowed. She looked at the camera, then at Richard, then at her book, and answered calmly, "It was about giving a voice back to someone who had been silent for too long." The journalist blinked. "So it's not a romance?" Emily smiled, Just a little. I didn't say that. He opened his mouth to speak again, but she walked away before he could, leaving the ballroom to wonder, was it a message? Was it love? Or was it both? And far away in the media room, an editor was already typing headlines, but none of them could capture what had really happened, because what Emily had done wasn't just walk into a room. She had redefined what it meant to stand inside it. The ballroom didn't return to normal after Richard's gesture. It couldn't. There was something altered in the air now, like the space itself had expanded. The laughter that followed was more careful, the conversations more measured. Even the music, though unchanged, seemed to echo differently through the chandelier-lit halls. Emily had not just been seen, she had been declared. And now, the world began to respond. It started subtly. A nod from a senator's wife, a glance from a tech CEO, a quiet offer of champagne from someone who had ignored her earlier. Emily noticed the shift not in words but in posture. People who once looked through her now looked to her. And then, as the night deepened, the first invitation came. She was standing near a floral archway by the entrance of the ballroom, trying to collect her breath, when a woman approached her with graceful confidence and a presence that silenced the space around her. Elizabeth Monroe, founder of the Monroe Foundation. A woman who had built schools across 3 continents and walked through conflict zones in heels without losing stride. "Emily," she said gently, as if they were old friends meeting after years. Emily turned, surprised but not intimidated. "Ms. Monroe." "Call me Elizabeth," she smiled. "After tonight, I suspect we'll be seeing more of each other." Emily hesitated. "I'm not sure what you mean." Elizabeth's tone softened. "You don't need to. Just listen." She pulled a small envelope from her clutch and handed it to her. Inside, a handwritten note on ivory paper, the edges gilded. "Emily Thompson, you've inspired more than you realize. Let's talk about how you can inspire thousands more. Elizabeth Monroe, Monroe Foundation." Emily read it twice. Her fingers trembled slightly. "I don't understand," she said honestly. "I'm not trained for anything like this." "That's exactly why you matter," Elizabeth replied. "You're not polished, you're real. You know what it means to be ignored, dismissed, overlooked. Girls all over this country feel the same way, and tonight you lit something in them." Emily felt her throat tighten. Elizabeth leaned in. "We don't need another celebrity on our campaign posters. We need someone whose story hurts, someone who earned every breath she takes." She paused. "Be our face, Emily. Be their voice." And then she was gone, leaving the card in her hand and a storm in her chest. Minutes later, another figure approached, a man this time, tall, bespectacled, with the precise energy of someone who knew his words carried weight. "Michael Crawford," he said, offering his hand. "Editor-in-chief at Legacy magazine. We'd like to feature you in our next issue." Emily blinked. "Me?" He chuckled gently. "You've just redrawn the lines of what power looks like. We'd be negligent not to tell your story." She didn't answer right away. She wasn't ready. Crawford noticed. "I understand. Take your time, but you're not invisible anymore. And that comes with invitations and expectations." When he walked away, Emily felt dizzy. People were seeing her now, not just as Richard Whitmore's unexpected guest, but as a symbol, a possibility, a disruption to the narrative they were used to telling. And that terrified her more than being ignored ever had. She slipped away to the gallery, needing air, needing space. Behind the safety of a tall velvet curtain, she found a small window that overlooked the city skyline. Below, the lights sparkled like promises. Cold, distant, endless. She touched the glass with her fingertips. She wasn't ready for all this. She wasn't prepared to become an idea. She was still the girl who folded sheets in silence, who had learned to speak softly so no one would hear her cry. She was still the child who had clutched the little prince as if the words could keep her warm. She was still learning how to hold her chin high without trembling inside. And yet, that girl was now standing in a gown worth more than all her past birthdays combined, being invited to stand beside people who shaped countries. It didn't make sense. She wasn't sure it ever would. She turned back toward the ballroom, and nearly collided with Richard. He had been looking for her, but when he saw her expression, he stopped. "You're overwhelmed," he said softly. She didn't respond, just nodded. "They're going to ask you for everything now," he said. "Stories, photos, pieces of yourself you've never shared. Some will pretend they care. Others will want to own your voice." She looked up at him, eyes wide. "Then why did you start this?" Richard was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Because your voice doesn't belong to silence anymore." And then, softer, "But you decide what to do with it." Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't expect the next words to come from her lips, but they did. "I need to think." He nodded. "Good. Let the world wait." But even as she returned to the ballroom, card from Elizabeth in her hand, name on the lips of strangers, fire still burning in her spine, she knew one thing with quiet certainty. Something had begun tonight, and whether she wanted it or not, she was no longer just a girl in a borrowed dress. The party below continued to sparkle. Strings of violin, laughter like crystal, glasses clinking like a metronome of pretense. But none of it followed Emily when she stepped onto the terrace. The door closed behind her with a gentle click, sealing her away from the world that had swallowed her whole just hours ago. The air was crisp, the kind that kissed your skin and whispered that the city below was alive, pulsing with millions of hearts, none of which knew her name last week. She leaned on the stone balustrade, breathing in the cold night. Her fingers still clutched Elizabeth's card. She hadn't put it away. Part of her didn't want to. The weight of it felt too real. She was still trying to understand what it meant to be seen. Then she heard the door open again. Soft steps, no urgency, no announcement. Richard. He didn't speak at first, just joined her by the railing, hands in his pockets, eyes on the skyline. Neither of them looked at the other. For a moment they just existed, together, in silence. Then, with a voice lower than usual, Richard said, "Do you want to know why I asked you to come tonight?" Emily didn't answer right away. "I'm not sure I'm ready to hear it." He gave a faint smile. "You're stronger than you think." The city glittered below them, towers and streets lit like veins in marble. A long pause passed between them before Richard finally broke it. "I used to clean windows," he said. Emily blinked, surprised. She turned to him slowly. He continued, "When I was 15, I'd sleep behind a laundromat during the week. On weekends, I'd sneak onto the university campus and scrub glass until my hands bled. No one asked where I came from. No one cared." He exhaled. "I stole bread once, from a gas station. I was hungry. The owner caught me. I thought he'd call the police." He paused again. But he didn't. Emily watched him, eyes searching. "He handed me the bread and said, 'Pay me back when you can, and pay it forward when you're able.'" She didn't speak. She let the silence hold him. "I never forgot that," Richard said. "When the hotel chain started taking off, when the first million hit the account, I still felt like the boy behind the glass, the one people looked through." His voice softened. "Then one morning I saw you." Emily blinked. "Me? You were polishing silver in the East Corridor. Everyone else walked past you, but you were humming. Your hands moved like the work mattered. You didn't try to be seen, and that's exactly why you were." She looked down, her throat tightened. "I didn't bring you tonight to make a point," he said gently. "I brought you because you reminded me of who I used to be, and because, maybe selfishly, I wanted to see how the world would react when they were faced with someone real." Emily's voice came out barely above a whisper. "They tried to tear me apart." He nodded. "I knew they would." "Then why?" Richard turned to face her now. "Because someone once gave me a chance when I had no name, no suit, no voice, and I've been waiting years to give that moment back to someone who deserved it." Emily couldn't breathe for a second. He stepped closer, slowly, but not intrusively. "You don't owe anyone an explanation for who you are," he said. "Not tonight, not ever. You don't belong to their stories, Emily." She met his eyes. "Then who do I belong to?" The words hung in the air like a fragile truth, and he didn't rush to answer. Instead, he said, "That's for you to decide." A long silence followed, and for once it wasn't heavy, it was warm. They both leaned back on the railing again, shoulders nearly touching, The city stretched out before them like a mirror of who they had been and who they might become. She finally spoke. "I'm scared of what comes next." "Good," Richard said. "If you weren't, it wouldn't mean anything." She smiled faintly, then asked, "Did you ever think someone like you and someone like me would end up in the same room?" He chuckled. "Every day, and every day I ignored it. Until now." A wind swept across the terrace then, lifting a loose strand of her hair. He reached up slowly, carefully, and tucked it behind her ear. Not possessively, not dramatically, just gently. Emily closed her eyes for a second. It had been years since someone touched her like she wouldn't break. She looked at him again, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with something dangerous, hope. But before either of them could speak again, a distant chime sounded behind the terrace doors. A ballroom staff member appeared, hesitant. "Mr. Whitmore, the charity director is requesting your presence." Richard didn't look away from her, but Emily nodded. "You should go." He studied her for a second longer. "I'll come back." And as he walked away, leaving her once again alone with the wind and the stars, she whispered to the night, "I'm not the same girl who walked in here." But what she didn't know yet was that neither was he. The ballroom had quieted again, not by design, but by instinct. The evening was reaching its final crescendo. Donors had danced, deals had been whispered, and glasses refilled like clockwork. The string quartet had softened their tempo. Somewhere near the entrance, murmurs of departure had begun. But just before the event could dissolve into coats and valets and photographs at the exit, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the central stage, microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, adjusting his tie, "before we close this year's Golden Phoenix Gala, we have one final voice to hear, one that reminded us tonight what this event is truly meant to honor." A few people raised brows. Others leaned in, curious. "In a world that talks too much and listens too little," the host continued, "someone chose to stand in silence and still moved us all." He paused, smiling toward the edge of the ballroom. "Miss Emily Thompson, would you join us?" Gasps. Half of the guests turned their heads. The other half simply froze. Emily sat near the side wall, half-shadowed beneath a crystal sconce, her breath caught in her chest as the spotlight shifted gently toward her. There was a long pause, a heartbeat of uncertainty. But she rose, not quickly, not theatrically, but with stillness, with resolve. She walked forward, past diamonds and tuxedos, past people who had whispered about her, dismissed her, feared her. And when she stepped onto the small stage, there was no podium, no notes, just her, bare, elegant, seen. She took the microphone and looked at them. "I don't have a speech prepared," she began, her voice soft but unwavering. "I didn't know I'd be standing here. Honestly, I wasn't supposed to be at this event at all." A few polite chuckles. She smiled faintly. "I came tonight because someone asked me to stop hiding, because someone believed the world needed to hear from someone like me. And I think maybe he was right." The room listened, still, unblinking. "I was raised in a place where silence was survival," she said, "where the loudest child was often the one hurt first, where dreaming was something you did with books, because reality didn't leave room for much else." She held up the tattered copy of The Little Prince. "This was my first gift. I found it in a box when I was 7. It taught me that sometimes the most important things are invisible to the eye, like kindness, like dignity, like self-worth." The silence deepened. "I was taught to be small, to be invisible, to keep my head down and my hands busy. And for a long time I did exactly that. Until one day, someone saw me. Not because I asked to be seen, not because I changed who I was, but because I was exactly who I had always been." Her voice wavered, just slightly. "I've scrubbed marble floors while people stepped over me. I folded sheets in silence while guests laughed 2 doors down. I've existed beside power without ever being invited to touch it." Her eyes scanned the room now. Brave, clear. "But tonight, I stood in the center of this ballroom, in this dress, with my name announced like it belonged here. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was surviving. I felt like I was becoming." The weight of her words pressed into the room like snowfall, quiet but irreversible. "I don't know what you'll say about me tomorrow," she continued. "Maybe I'll be a headline. Maybe I'll be a mistake. Maybe I'll just be forgotten." She paused. "But I know what I am." Another pause. Intentional. Strong. "I'm not a prop. I'm not a project. I'm not a phase." Her voice tightened. "I'm the result of every no that didn't break me, of every floor I cleaned without thanks, of every day I woke up and kept going even when no one clapped." She stepped forward. "And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of story worth hearing." The last line fell like thunder, and for a heartbeat, the room didn't move. Then, a single person stood. Elizabeth Monroe, followed by another, then another, until the entire ballroom rose to their feet, hands coming together in waves of applause, no longer out of politeness, not out of curiosity, but out of something rarer, respect. Emily blinked. Her throat swelled. She didn't cry. She simply nodded once, set the microphone down and stepped off the stage. As she walked past the sea of guests now clapping for her, not for Richard, not for the spectacle, but for her, she caught his eyes across the crowd. He wasn't clapping, but his hands were folded, and in his expression was something deeper than pride, a kind of awe. She passed him, brushing lightly against his sleeve, and for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder. Maybe this night hadn't been about becoming someone new. Maybe it had always been about finally showing the world who she already was. The morning after the gala began like any other, until it didn't. At 7:03 a.m., South the first headline hit, "Cinderella at the Ball, Maid speech shakes Golden Phoenix Gala." The Times by 7:47, there were 3 more. The girl in the midnight dress, who is Emily Thompson? Legacy magazine, from floor cleaner to front page, a night the elite won't forget. NY Political, Richard Whitmore's mysterious guest leaves guests, speechless. Vogue Insider. By 8:30, her name was trending in 3 countries. By 10 plus, the story had reached breakfast tables across America. But more powerful than the media storm were the whispers on the ground, in break rooms, in subway cars, in hospital corridors, in school lounges and single mothers' apartments, in community centers, on TikTok, and in the corners of women's shelters. And they didn't ask, "Who is she?" They said, "She sounds like me." A video clip of Emily's speech, just under 5 minutes long, circulated faster than any ad campaign ever could. There was no filter, no background music, just her voice, her eyes, her truth. And people listened. Comments flooded in. "I've cleaned houses for 14 years. No one's ever said we mattered. Until now. She just spoke everything I've never had the words to say. I watched this on the bus with my daughter. We cried together. She didn't just walk into that ballroom. She kicked the damn door open for the rest of us." But it wasn't just digital. In a high school in Detroit, a teacher printed her speech and taped it to the wall with the caption, "If you've ever felt invisible, read this." In a small diner in Oklahoma, a waitress wiped a tear behind the counter and said to a regular, "She made me feel proud to wear this apron." And in the basement of an aging women's shelter in East Harlem, someone whispered, "If she can be seen, maybe we can be saved." Meanwhile, Emily sat in the back seat of a black car driving slowly through Manhattan. She hadn't slept. Her phone was on airplane mode. She hadn't opened it since midnight, but she didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the air, like a glass that had shattered and couldn't be put back together the same way again. Next to her, Richard was silent. Respectfully so. He had insisted the driver take the long route back to the estate. Not for comfort, but for time. She stared out the window. Billboards, cafes, people living their lives like nothing had changed. But everything had. And not just for her. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally. Emily didn't respond right away. Then softly, "No. But I'm scared." He nodded. "That means you're awake." She turned to him. "They're going to ask me to speak again, to lead, to represent." "You don't have to do any of it," he said. "You already did more than enough." "That's the problem," she whispered. "Now I can't go back." She opened her phone. Hundreds of missed calls. thousands of messages, a voicemail from Elizabeth Monroe, a dozen requests from talk shows, interview offers, even a message from a senator's assistant asking if she would consider sharing her story before the Congressional Subcommittee on Working Class Women. She closed it again. It was too much, and yet, when she looked at her reflection in the window, she didn't see the maid from Whitmore's estate anymore. She saw a woman with gravity, with something to lose. Back at the estate, she stepped out of the car into soft morning fog. The place looked the same, silent, gilded, unmoving. But Emily wasn't the same, and that was enough to change everything. In the kitchen, the staff watched her like they didn't know if they should speak. She gave them a nod, gentle but commanding. Not arrogant, just centered. She went upstairs to her room, now referred to quietly as Miss Thompson's quarters, and sat on the edge of her bed. The dress was still draped over the chair. The book still lay beside her pillow. She picked it up. The Little Prince. A page was folded where she'd left off years ago. She opened it. You become responsible forever for what you have tamed. She closed her eyes. It wasn't about the fame or the applause. It was about the ripple, the quiet one, the invisible chain reaction of a girl being seen. And in that seeing, making others believe they could be seen too. And somewhere across the country, in a modest home in New Mexico, a teenage girl closed her laptop after watching the video. She looked in the mirror and whispered, "Me too." The world didn't stop after the gala, but it did. Listen. The silence that had once defined Emily Thompson was now being replaced by echoes, echoes of something that couldn't be ignored anymore. Her words had stirred something dormant, something buried under dust and polite indifference. But Emily hadn't asked to become a symbol. She had only asked to be heard once. Still, the world kept calling. Every morning brought a new email, a new headline, a new invitation to speak. News outlets wanted interviews, talk shows offered flights and hotel suites, influencers wanted photos, authors asked for co-written memoirs. She turned them all down. What she said that night had never been for a spotlight. It had been a release, a truth released from a cage too long bolted shut. But now she needed something quieter, something real. So she stayed at the Whitmore estate a while longer, no longer as invisible staff, but as a woman in transition. She walked the same halls where she had once polished doorknobs, only now she did it with purpose, with clarity. She found herself returning to the terrace each evening. That was where the noise settled, where her mind could breathe. The air was crisp, the garden lights flickered below, and often she brought the Little Prince with her, not to read, but to remember. One night, as fog crept across the lawn and distant horns echoed from the city, she whispered aloud, "I don't want to be a headline." Richard was behind her. She hadn't heard him come. "You won't be," he said gently. "Not if you write your own story." That's when it clicked. She couldn't go back to silence, but she could choose how to use her voice. The next morning, she drafted a letter. Simple, honest, unfiltered. It's about time we recognize the girls who have been ignored, forgotten, silenced. There are millions of girls in the world who have never been told their voice matters, who have been taught to be quiet, small, obedient. I was one of them. I'm not anymore, and I don't want them to wait as long as I did. So I'm building something, not for me, for them. That was the birth of Voice from the Shadows, a grassroots initiative designed to find the girls the world had forgotten, to bring them out of corners, out of shelters, out of back hallways, and into light. The first event was held in a school gymnasium in Queens. No red carpet, no gowns, just folding chairs, chipped paint, and rows of teenage girls with tired eyes and guarded hearts. Emily stood in front of them. No microphone, no script. She told them about the girl who scrubbed silver in silence, about the night she walked down marble stairs and almost fell, about the moment she realized her invisibility wasn't her identity. She ended with, "You don't need to be saved, you need to be seen, and I see you." Some girls cried, some didn't, but all of them leaned in. From there, the movement grew. By the end of the month, there were mentorship circles in 5 cities. By the 3rd month, 20. Every time Emily walked into a room, she asked the same question. What were you never allowed to say? She didn't correct their grammar. She didn't judge their stories. She just let them speak. And slowly the shadows began to thin. At night she'd go home to the estate, not the same girl who once lived in the staff quarters, but not someone entirely new either. Just herself, finally. Richard remained near, never imposing. He helped open doors, made quiet calls, redirected media interest toward the mission instead of the myth. Sometimes he sat in the back of her sessions, just listening. Once, after a workshop with girls from a group home in Newark, he pulled her aside. "You know," he said softly, "there are people who build empires from stone, and then there are those who build them from broken pieces." Emily looked at him. "And which one am I?" He smiled. "The one who taught me the second was possible. It wasn't romance yet, but it was something deeper. Respect, mutual understanding. A connection forged in silence, built in truth." One night, a girl handed Emily a drawing she had made during a session. It showed a girl standing alone under a street lamp, her face barely visible. Across the top, written in pencil, "Thank you for turning on the light." Emily kept that drawing, framed it beside her desk. Alongside it sat the little prince, now aged with corners curled, pages lined with notes. A reminder that books could save, that a sentence could change a life. As the months passed, murals began appearing in unexpected places. Alleys, train stations, school walls. All of them depicted the same silhouette, a girl standing on a staircase, holding a book to her chest, eyes forward. Underneath, "We were never voiceless, just unheard." It became the symbol of a movement she never intended to start. And still she lived simply. No luxury car, no publicist, no perfume ads. Just a woman with a mission, a history. And finally a name that meant something beyond its absence. Because Emily Thompson was no longer the girl behind the curtain. She was the one who pulled it back. She didn't ask for the stage, nor for power. She just wanted to be heard, at least once, with her whole heart. But by breaking her own silence, Emily gave a voice to thousands of others still living in the shadows. Because sometimes all someone needs is to be seen. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Your support is what allows us to continue bringing stories like this. Thank you for being here.